Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome everyone to Tabadlab Policy Roundtable. This is our regular sort of feature where we try and get together a group of experts to talk about something that is policy relevant and learn more about it. Since the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic and the various crises that it has spurred, one of the issues that has seen a global traction is a conversation about livelihoods and particularly some sort of a basic subsistence income, especially in a situation of crisis like the one that the pandemic has prompted. One of the more exciting areas within economic theory and practice is the idea of a universal basic income, a set amount of income that is provided to every citizen, hence universal. Basic, so that it's not excessive, but it's not so low that you can't meet your basic needs with it. And of course, income self-explanatory. So the idea of universal basic income has really gained traction, and I think always does when there's a crisis of this magnitude and this nature. The conversation in various countries takes a different shape. In Pakistan, we had the ESAS Emergency Cash Program as a starting point to initiate a conversation about UBI. Globally, there's other examples of how it's been done. There's been pilots and tests in Africa and Europe, and a growing movement within the United States. We've tried to bring together what we think is a fantastic all-star panel of practitioners and observers and researchers from around the world. Really pleased to welcome the entire panel. And let's bring them on screen and introduce them really quick. Joining us from India is Sarath Davala. He's the chairperson of the Basic Income Earth Network. He's kind of the global head of the movement, or at least one of the movements for universal basic income. We have Caroline Teti joining us from Kenya. Caroline has been on the leadership front as far as executing and running a basic income, a universal basic income program through the organization GiveDirectly, and she's based in Nairobi and joining us from there. Really great to have you with us as well. We have from the Center for Global Development, Megan O'Donnell, who's done increasingly important and really useful summation and analysis of various social protection and UBI programs, particularly the one that was initiated by Pakistan as one of her more recent publications, and she follows UBI closely. And last but definitely not least, we have Scott Santens, who, if you are anywhere close to social media, is kind of the go-to global guru for all things UBI. I wanted to, in the tradition of Pakistanis welcoming Indians, I wanted to start the conversation with Sarath. And Sarath, maybe, as a layperson for me, I've given you my understanding of what UBI is, but maybe explain to those that are tuning in and that will watch this later on, what is universal basic income? Why is it important? And how does the COVID-19 crisis create a new opportunity to have this conversation domestically in all of our home countries and globally as well? Sarath.
Thank you, Musharraf, and thank you the entire team that has put this together, and it's really a pleasure. I was so thrilled to see that discussion in Pakistan about income. Kind of a basic definition, what we mean by basic income when we are talking about basic income. When we say the basic income, we say it has 5 important elements. Some people add a 6th one. The 5 are like it is universal, which means that every normal resident of a territory should be given a basic income. It is only cash and not coupons or any other kinds of currencies. It's normal cash which everybody uses. It is periodic, which means it is monthly, like all of us receive a salary. It is individual as opposed to household. Most of the development programs usually are focused on households. And the most important and really the cutting edge of this concept is that it is unconditional. There are no conditions whatsoever. There's some people who add a couple of other things, but I will not go into those things, such as, in Europe they say high enough, or and some people say it should be a legal right so that it is non-withdrawable, and those are other things. But these five are the core principles, and these days a lot of programs are, because basic income is very hot. Everybody wants to say that this is basic income. Country is giving basic income. This is basic income. I think media, how it is project. But then the real test is that whether it satisfies all these five criteria. Now, just to say that why is it significant? Why is it important? And how does it compare with other things? Okay, if you take, for example, India. We spent a lot of money in the last 10, 15 years. I think our social spending has really gone up. But then the basic problem is that our delivery has been extremely poor. The design of the programs have been extremely poor. Like one of our largest programs is that PDS, the Public Distribution System, which is the food security program. We spend about 30 billion every year now for the entire country. But the point is the delivery really poor. But then basic income, there is only one that is only one practical reason why basic income is an easier way, but that is not the most important justification for basic income. The most important justification for basic income is that every person, a man, woman, and child on earth, should have a basic ground to stand on, which can come only through cash, and unconditional cash. There should be no conditions whatsoever. So that is the vision. Now, when people say that we don't have money for it, I think one should really go into how are we spending the existing amount of money that we allocate, and is it an efficient way of doing it or not? We need to question all those things. Okay, I think eventually we will come to all those discussions. But in India, for example, we strongly argue for a basic income because the existing programs do not really deliver. I think I'll pause there, Musharraf. I think you can bring in others.
Sure, Bob. I mean, I really want to come back to that assertion about them not working, because so many of us around the world have looked at the National Rural Employment Guarantee scheme and things like Bolsa Familia, and seen that those are the building blocks towards the kind of idealized version of universal basic income. But I think a lot of those conversations, I want to take the conversation to Caroline. Caroline, a lot of those conversations are macro, they're big picture, and they're theoretical, right? They're dealing with the abstraction of these principles. You've actually sort of overseen the execution of universal basic income pilots in Africa. Talk to us a little bit about how that works, what it means to do a pilot of that nature, and what the results have told us, or what we've learned from those results, and how we can apply those lessons across other geographies and other social and political contexts. Caroline?
Thank you. So the universal basic income experiment that we're running in Kenya has been on for the past, this is the 4th year. So we started in 2016 and we're still running. This program is basically based in rural Kenya, targeting people who are living on, under $3 a day. Most of them are within the $1 mark, and some of them, have gone to the extent of going between 2 weeks and 1 month without touching actual cash. So we are talking about populations that, if you were to start thinking about other, interventions, you can talk about providing universal health, providing universal basic education, but they still are living on the edge and are looking for solutions to things that they can be the only ones to decide in their households. And we have so far been able to, launch an experiment that is targeting 20,000 people, and this experiment will run for 12 years. So pretty much we are walking the journey with these recipients since October 2016, and we hope that, we can continue with this journey and be able to tell the world the story of what a real basic income would be. So in these villages, we basically we are giving every individual 18 years and above receives a basic income. It is a value of $22 a month for every adult, and it is delivered every month through mobile money. A lot of us may ask, what would $22 do? And we can only ask that if we are living on $22 for lunch, and would never imagine what somebody living on $1 or under $1 a day, or people who can't even afford food, are able to afford themselves. What we've seen with this experiment is that the one thing that it has done is it's brought some level of equity and trust in these communities, things that we had not even put in as the test the test questions or research questions for the experiment that we are running. But people, community members, came back and told us that giving us a basic income has done things that we had not imagined would happen in our communities. It has improved, relationships at the household level. Couples can be able to report, their own experience with the basic income. We have seen behaviors that we would not have predicted if we had not started this experiment. Behaviors bordering on, people taking risks on things they would not do if they did not have an income completely. The basic income experiment we are running in Kenya has now had, a very quick assessment of how it impacts the outcomes of pandemics such as COVID-19. And we have seen that, people who are receiving a basic income are better than people who did not have nothing absolutely, who did not have anything absolutely. So we see that, for example, people who were on a basic income had started businesses. Others who had also not received a basic income also had started their businesses. But when the pandemic came, both these businesses were affected. People lost their profits, people lost clients, but the level of effect on people who had a basic income could not be compared with people who did not have a basic income. Like, people who had a basic income could still have some few dollars to punch back into the businesses, unlike the others whose businesses just died. And we saw that also in terms of health and preparedness to mitigate risks, health risks such as COVID-19. We have seen people who have, taken medical insurance and, have a better assurance in case they have a health issue, that they can be able to, go to the hospital and be assured of attention. Food security is another thing that, in times of pandemics such as this, and this pandemic hit at a time when the country was experiencing lean season, and in times such as this, what would happen is people would literally go without food or just live on a meal a day. And we have seen through the rapid assessment that we did for COVID-19 that the basic income families were better off in terms of access to food. They were less likely to go hungry as compared to people who did not receive a basic income. So that basically is very quick preview of how this is happening, and would be glad to talk more about the details as we continue the discussion.
Of course, that I think fascinating insights, and also eye-opening and really, I think, humbling at some level. Scott, I was talking to a friend in the U.S. who lost his job in New York City, and there was the big grant where people were given a certain amount. I think it was, again, it may differ from state to state, but if I remember correctly, it was $1,600 as kind of a one-time payment at the start of the pandemic. And I think that really buoyed the kind of confidence of advocates for universal basic income because of the profound impact it had on people's lives. Obviously, there's the observation of the stark difference between a program that is running on $22 per adult versus this very dramatically or substantially larger amounts when we look at programs like in Finland or in other parts of Europe. Let's leave aside the inequality debate, because I think it's an important one, but it's not. It doesn't fundamentally. I think we can come back to it, but talk to me a little bit about the impact of the different programs around the world that governments have undertaken to provide a kind of boost, or not just a boost, a protective layer from an income standpoint, and how that has boosted the interest in the conversation around universal basic income that you so ably have been curating these last few years?
Yeah, thanks. I would say that, first of all, it was really interesting to see our response to this crisis here, especially in the U.S., and what that even says about the conversation and about the existing safety net. So, for example, here, the amount actually, we did a $1,200 stimulus payment, and that wasn't it wasn't fully universal here in the U.S., and that's the case for actually a lot of places around the world. Um, but it went to most people. It went to those who were earning under 75,000 here in the U.S., and then it clawed it back a little bit. So at the point of reaching, $99,000, then no one got the stimulus check who was earning more than that, although that was based on previous years of taxes. And so that too, shows even the problems with the existing system as well, that we found as a response to that, because then we saw, okay, so the logic was those who are earning less than that amount are in need, so we should get them this extra $1,200. And then in the process of doing that, we're like, okay, so how do we determine if you're earning under that amount? Okay, so we have to use taxes from 2018, and for those who actually have filed already in 2019. But then there are people who had seen their incomes drop in 2020 who were earning above that amount previously when they filed, so they were left out. And then there were those who weren't we're in this age range where, let's say they're over 17 years old, but then they're claimed as a dependent in their taxes by their parents, so then they were excluded, and anyone who was claimed as a dependent was excluded from this. So there's a lot of people who were excluded who was actually meant to be part of this assistance. And I think that too shows the value of doing something with unconditional and universal, so that you don't exclude anyone who's in need as a result of this. And another aspect too, and this was something that you saw in country after country as well, where there was an immediate recognition of the fact that there were a very large amount and growing number of people who are earning their incomes in a more freelance, self-employed, gig labor kind of way. And these people were being excluded from the existing safety nets. They weren't qualifying for unemployment. They weren't qualifying, for healthcare and these things. So then here in the US and in Canada and elsewhere, they said, okay, well, let's actually bring these people into the safety net and make it easier for them to qualify for this amount. And so here in the US, they were able to get $600 per week. And so that's $2,400 per month, and they were getting zero, any kind of unemployment assistance before that. And then now they were brought in because the government just immediately said, oh, wait, there's all these people that we've been entirely ignoring. Let's go ahead and not ignore them anymore. And another interesting thing that we did here in the US was, besides just looking at that group, we said, okay, those who are receiving unemployment, this varies a lot state to state to state. And let's say someone's only getting, $500 per month, and that's just ridiculously low. And this isn't a situation where we're trying to encourage people to get back into the labor market, because those jobs don't exist. So because these jobs don't exist and there's no reason to try to force them back to work, then let's actually just try to replace their incomes to as much as 100% as possible. So here in the US, our solution to that was saying, all right, well, let's just add a flat $600 per week boost to everybody's unemployment, state by state by state by state. And that was something that's also somewhat like a basic income. And as a result of that too, that very large macroeconomic impact was that, oh, hey, thanks to that spending, then we were actually able to not see as much job loss as we would have seen otherwise, because people were able to spend that money into their economies. And whereas if they hadn't had that money, then you would have seen these jobs dry up in a way that you wouldn't have just seen, from the pandemic alone, as long as there was spending available. So, and there was this approach in our country and in other countries across the world. Let's say there was more of like the Germany's Kurzarbeit policy, which is saying, all right, we recognize there's lots being people unemployed. Let's try to make sure that they retain some amount of income. So you saw, say, government saying, let's try to maintain 60% of income or 70% or 80% or 90% of income. And then that money went through employers, and then those employers paid the people as they usually would, except those people just weren't doing work as they usually would. And all of this was a way of government saying, all right, let's try to make sure that incomes are maintained. What are the best ways of doing that? Let's recognize that people are excluded who usually aren't. And it's just because of all of that, people started thinking and looking at UBI in a different way, going, wow, UBI would solve so many of these issues that we're experiencing right now. And it would actually have a lot of these positives that we're seeing from these things that we're trying. And so maybe we should look into this really on a permanent basis, so it's ready for the next disaster, and that we know there is going to be another disaster. There's always going to be another disaster. And I also argue that poverty has always been an ongoing human disaster.
I think that's a great sort of segue into what I wanted to pose to Megan. Megan, talk a little bit about how all of this, how we can make sense of all of this from all these disparate angles. There's the kind of small community-based, charity slash, NGO activism that is experimenting in Africa and in places in South Asia and I'm sure in Latin America as well. There's the really big programs in India that, Sarath, I think, has categorized as being not as effective as something like a UBI might be. You've examined the Pakistani attempt to do this. It is certainly not UBI, but it's as close as we've ever come, particularly in terms of the quantum that was provided through the ESAS emergency cash program. When you look at all this as a student and as a researcher of these kind of initiatives, is it fair to say that maybe it's too crude for us to try and put all these things under the same generic UBI label?
I think so, at least for the moment. And I'll give you some sort of concrete details that you may already be aware of for the Pakistani case in particular. So when we looked at the ESAS Emergency Cash Assistance Program, and we look and sort of compare that to what a basic income would enable in terms of meeting basic needs, as you mentioned, it's certainly a step in the right direction, but it doesn't get the population nearly as far as they would need to. So the World Development Indicators indicate that the bottom 40% of the Pakistani population needs about $2.60 US a day to meet their basic needs when we're talking about food and housing and other essentials. What ESAS was able to give, which is 12,000 Pakistani rupees or $75 US over a 4-month period, because the program assumed an average household size of over 6 people, nearly 7 people, that breaks down to just $11.25 a person over a 4-month period. So then we're looking at just 9 cents US a day. So it's better than nothing, especially in a country context where some of that could go quite a bit in terms of maybe providing insulation against food insecurity, for example. But it's certainly not approaching UBI level, for example, to some of the context that Scott and Sarath have spoken about, or that Caroline is evaluating in the Kenyan context. So I think, we can think about social assistance and social protection writ large. And then I think we can think about UBI as a really high potential way of providing that social assistance. When Sarath started out talking about the particular dimensions of UBI, some of these are very encouraging to me as someone who is approaching these conversations from a gender analysis angle. And that's because a lot of those other social protection programs, ESAS included, is still dealing at household level. So we still have to worry about intra-household allocation of resources. Everything we know from the gender literature suggests that women and girls are less likely to benefit when we have one lump sum delivered to a household head that may not be distributed equally or equitably among household members by gender and otherwise. So when we think about the universal nature of UBI, especially because it's being delivered individually, person by person, it's promising for us from a gender perspective, because that means, of course, as Sarath alluded to at the beginning, if we assume proper and sort of perfect implementation, that women and girls will be reached equally. And so that could go quite a long way in terms of some of the gender equality and broader equality outcomes that we're all concerned with. I'll say in particular, because these two issues are really top of mind in the COVID context. When we think about UBI, we see potential for interactions to decrease gender-based violence and to support survivors, and also to provide a window to start to acknowledge over a much longer time horizon the value of unpaid care work, important work for all of us, households and economies at large, that is currently pretty much entirely uncompensated on a global scale. When we think about GBV, we know that gender-based violence was a human rights issue and a development issue, of course, that predated the pandemic. But more than ever before, there's been media attention and sort of catalyzed momentum around the need to increase attention to and financing to prevent this issue. And myself and co-authors at CGD, Amber Peterman and others, we've traced the pathways through which GBV could increase in pandemic contexts and in other crises. One of the most sort of obvious that's top of mind is when households experience economic strain, when they are grappling with risks of food insecurity and poverty, tensions rise, familial stress rises, and that is likely, unfortunately, to manifest in physical violence towards women and children disproportionately. And so if a UBI or some sort of meaningful cash transfer can ease some of those tensions, we see that on the front end, violence may be likely to decrease. And there's a decent evidence base, both quantitative and qualitative, sort of mixed method studies that suggest that. On the back end, we see oftentimes that those who are experiencing violence, survivors themselves, often don't have the means of exiting those households, of escaping those sort of dangerous contexts. And so a UBI, again, because if delivered individually, would ease some of that economic dependency of survivors on the perpetrators of this violence. And so we see that as catalytic from sort of a gender equality perspective.
Sure, but Megan, sorry, I think this is a really vital part of the conversation, and I want to get other people to sort of say a few things on gender and then come back, because I know there's so please hold that thought. But I just wanted to take this to Caroline. Caroline, this dimension of gender and the clear evidence, and it also appeals to reason, right? Having this kind of basic income would empower and enable greater autonomy, which directly would result in greater freedom. All of a sudden, though, whereas in this group and amongst most of our audience, people would be excited about women having that autonomy and freedom. Certainly, this triggers a number of cultural discourse concerns, right? The one that I wanted to discuss with the whole group was this idea of laziness. And this is an old trope that's used by, I hate to say it, but Republican friends and neocons and the sort who are not really, they don't see the value of this kind of discourse. But putting that cultural aspect aside, how do you deal with the micro level cultural challenge that something like UBI clearly would pose in small communities, and then obviously at the larger national sort of and beyond that stage?
Actually, before you engage in a UBI, intervention or see people receiving universal basic income real time, you can create lots and lots of myths and misconceptions in your brains of what could go wrong. And, until you get to the communities and see the reality, then you will be able to tell the story of UBI. Really resonating with what Megan is talking about, gender dynamics and the fact that if we are not careful, epidemics and disasters could exacerbate gender inequalities, especially in households. What we are seeing with the basic income is we are seeing a reversal of those inequalities, and assumptions that people have made that people will stop working, people will be lazy because they're receiving a basic income is actually not true. If anything, a universal basic income creates hope. And we've seen it at micro level in rural villages where people said, today I work, I get an income, and I feel what people who have an income feel like. And it's not just the feeling, it is the ability to be able to frame my mind, to think beyond today, and the assurance that I'm going to be able to receive money month on month until 12 years is something that has, shaped people's minds in different ways. We have people who had lost hope in life, and because of accessing a universal basic income, they say, one old woman once told me that, before you came to this community, I was sure I was going to die in 5 years. But now today I can tell you I am not dying. I'm not dying because I can afford food and I can afford healthcare. That's just one level of looking at it. When you look at it from the job perspective, a UBI doesn't just, give people hope. It gives people choices for the jobs that they want to do. It gives people opportunity to create jobs. It gives people an opportunity to be less dependent and be more innovative and creative. We have one gentleman in our experiment area who was working in the city as a guard, and at that time his income was not just enough to to take care of him. He could not live on that income, but he could also not send any money to his home area. So when we enrolled him and his wife in the basic income project, he said, you know what, now I can do the things that I love most. I am going back to the village and I can be with my family and I can be more peaceful. And he stopped working in the city. So when people think about people will be lazy and they will not be working, there are people who actually have things that they value and they cherish and which can make their families happier and more prosperous. But because they don't have catalytic resources for them to start off those types of ventures, they take risks of going out even when there is no hope and there is no value in what they're doing. UBI, finally, UBI has countered most of the cultural beliefs that people thought. In the communities where we're working, mostly patriarchal, in communities where men are mostly breadwinners bringing in money and women are recipients of those incomes, men make determination of how the money they bring home is spent. We are seeing communities where women and their husbands sit on the table to discuss expenditures and plans for the family, plus making decisions on who should be going out to look for a job and who should be remaining home to take care of the children. So UBI is very, very empowering. Before you experience it, you can make judgments about people getting lazy or people not working.
That's a really powerful counterpoint to, I think, what is one of the most predictable sort of areas of resistance. Scott, I mentioned Republican and neocon. Those are both decidedly American terms because so much of the thinking around these things, comes from my friends who attended the University of Chicago and got PhDs. And there's one in particular that I'm thinking of who's a dear friend, but also thinks in a totally different way. For someone like me, of course, UBI is the ultimate goal. So what you want is you want to encourage governments that do Bolsa Familia or that do BISP or ESAS, and you definitely want to learn from the experiences of GiveDirectly and other pilots, and bit by bit convince governments that actually a genuinely universal basic income in the way that Sarath had defined it is a political possibility. What the question I had was whether you think it's within the political discourse of the U.S. today, whether you think something like a UBI, even if it's scaled down a little bit, not just in terms of dollar amount, but if it's not truly universal, but something that approximates UBI better than whatever the U.S. has today, is that a political possibility given the environment, or what? Because this cultural resistance, both to various kinds of empowerment, and of course, there's not just the gender divide in the U.S. There's a class divide, there's geographical divides, urban, rural, and of course, race is the one that we all sort of have gotten to see over the last year or so. How is the political discourse set for UBI, and has the COVID-19 experience expanded the space to talk more about it and to get people to sign up to it?
Yeah, absolutely. But before I get into that, I just want to tack on to what was being discussed too previously. I just think it really is an important fundamental aspect of UBI, and that's the fact that unpaid work is seen. And so most unpaid work, especially unpaid care work, tends to be done by women, and this is true around the world. And again, when I mentioned earlier about the gig laborers being left out of the safety nets, and like if you want to talk about people being left of the safety net doing important work, then you really got to talk about unpaid care work and volunteers in general, just everyone who is doing unpaid work, and especially, and then we saw during this pandemic, we're leaning more on that than we were before. So there has been a large drop of women out of the labor market here in the U.S., and a lot of that has been because there needed to be caring done for kids at home due to the closing of schools, and women were the ones who, as always, tend to take that burden onto themselves, and by doing that, like, we have increased gender inequality, and we are not looking and recognizing the importance of this work, even though like we're right now seeing and saying that this work is really extremely important and needs to be done. So it's also, and that ties into too this idea, when people say, won't people stop working? It's funny. For the most part, it's like that itself is more gendered, because that's something that really men will ask, but women are not asking for more work. They're asking for everything that they're doing to actually be recognized by the men who tend to be ignoring it. So I just wanted to add a little bit more to that. But as far as like the realistic political accomplishment of UBI here in the U.S., this pandemic has really opened up this discussion, because again, what we were doing obviously wasn't working, and some of what we did worked to a better degree. And when it came like politically, it was really interesting to see that both sides like immediately started talking about, well, let's get money to people directly. And the discussion was more about, it was less about should we do that, but it was more about should we have a cutoff point, and how do we design that cutoff point? Where should it be? What should like the slope be? Should it be 5% or 10% or whatever? Like how many people should we exclude, if we'd exclude anybody? And that was the discussion. So it was great to see that we were really essentially talking about what's the best way of going about this, given the fact that we're not doing this. So again, it's should we use Social Security? Should we go through the IRS? And those are the questions that I would much prefer that we get into, instead of should we do it or not. But yeah, politically speaking, there was the only thing that both the Republicans and Democratic parties agreed on. And even when we couldn't do a second package, so we're still like fighting over the fact that we've only gotten one stimulus check out. And this whole time when both sides have been debating what the next package should be, in that package has always been, let's get more checks out. And again, who should they go to? and what should the clawback be and whatnot. But that's something we agree on. So I do think that going forward, like we happen to be in the U.S. at this really interesting historical juncture where Trump is now leaving office and Biden is beginning. So there is this transition during a time of incredible economic suffering and disruption. And so there's the potential for bigger ideas that were not previously possible to be talked about. And I guess, here in the US too, there's just the reality of the fact that we don't even know if we're going to have a divided or united government here going forward next year. So, we don't know if Georgia is going to elect Democratic senators or Republican senators. And if they do elect Democratic senators, then Democrats would have control of the House and Senate and the presidency, in which case this would be, I think, much more likely. But then even if that didn't happen and Republicans maintain control of the Senate, then because this is the only thing we'd agree upon, that too makes it possible that it could be seen as essentially like the one program that one of the few programs that we could actually pass because it's something that could have Republican support versus all the other things that Democrats may want to do that they wouldn't agree to. So in both cases, it seems it really is opening this door for this discussion in a way that hasn't existed before. And I personally am hopeful that we can actually make some serious progress and possibly even accomplish this to some degree. And yeah, it can be any amount. Like you don't need to start at a poverty level. I personally prefer that we start that. And also I'd prefer that right now we just get the money out and not worry about deficits. And certainly, that's the fight around the world, is that people are going to have to fight against the austerity that was opposed in so many countries during the previous crisis. And hopefully this time we're saying, all right, we shouldn't do austerity again. Let's make sure people get money. And I think that's possible. And I think that we've, learned our lessons from last time. And I hope there's enough movement and social pressure on politicians to make sure that we definitely do not do austerity this time around, and that we instead do look at what we are seeing around the world with these semi-UBI kind of approaches and just continuing to go that way.
Thanks, Scott. Sarath, I want to come to you. The question of getting all of those programs that you talked about. India is a great, I think, laboratory for all of this. You mentioned a number of programs that are social protection writ large, but that don't qualify as UBI. In some cases, there are massive sort of structures of political economy that are supporting the continuation of these conditional systems, whether it's the food security program. In Pakistan, we had this wheat support price, and you give away wheat and other sort of food items. There's all these supply chains that benefit from the non-cash transfer and the non-conditional sort of instruments. So when you argue for a basic income, you're not just arguing for more fiscal allocations and for the universality of your program. You're also arguing, in a sense, against the existing political economies of the conditional programs that are non-cash based. How do you navigate that difficult terrain, and what success do you think you've had, and to what extent is the political discourse one that favors a universal basic income in a place like India? Sarath, you'll have to unmute.
Let's get to, I think I have...
Yeah, you're good now. You're good.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. I think let's get to the bottom of the earlier, I think the cultural knee-jerk reaction to basic income, unconditional basic income, is that people will become lazy. Let's put it in the the context of how the leisure class looks at the working classes. It's ironic that the leisure class is what is saying that they will become lazy. So we don't even need a pilot study to prove this, and we can clearly see that this is a prejudice of one class against the other classes. It's like the prejudice of the men against women. These are the folklore and the folk tales you create about the other classes. So if that is the case, if unconditional cash transfer or a basic income is going to make people lazy, I think all the children of people get unconditional cash transfers from their parents, don't they, for life? In some cases, should they become lazy? Have they become lazy? Do we even say that? So anyway, the point is that in any power relations, interclass relations, this is the kind of what the masters thought about the slaves and the nature of slaves. So this translates itself immediately into the design poverty alleviation programs. And then we say, now to this fellow, I should not give money which is fungible. I should give rice. Doesn't matter if it is rice which is rotten, doesn't matter. So in India, we have this culture of giving bicycles, saris, clothes, blankets, you name it. I mean, politicians love to come and hand over, take pictures, and then say that, we are giving them. So the point is, I think the first liberating thing with cash comes and liberates you from that role of being a supplicant. You were talking about NREGA. This is a National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. The only good thing about that is that it is self-selection. Nobody selects who should do that. But it is about manual labor, which means automatically, I think, those who don't do manual labor are automatically ruled out of that. Now, the problem with that also is the same design. The design problem is that there is a bureaucrat who's deciding what work to be done, who to employ, how much to give, when to give. There is a huge bureaucracy involved in that. And you, at the end of the day, is again a supplicant. I think we are talking, I think Megan talked about this, elaborated the individual thing in terms of gender relations. We say that I think one of the things this individual cash transfer does is to take you out of, give you the freedom to say no, as Carl would put it, in the sense that you can get out of a toxic relationship, you can get out of a very exploitative employment relationship if you have this autonomy. Okay, it makes you autonomous. It gives you that amount of freedom. Now, the point is that I have problems with most of the so-called development schemes that are designed. We have so many cash transfers. It is not that we don't have cash transfers. We have so many cash transfers, but all of them are conditional. Either they are given to students or they are given to people who are disabled, or you have to show and prove some disability, including if you have to be pregnant, and then that's also seen as a disability. You have to prove that you are somewhere disabled, ill, or not capable of being in the labor market. So the point is, how does one liberate oneself and get out and create a system of transfer where you retain the human dignity, basically? At the end of the day, that is what basic income is all about. So in India, it is gaining traction. I'll tell you how it is gaining traction. People are not prima facie accepting the whole basket. You know where it is starting? It's actually starting at the most important part of the basic income system is the unconditionality. Now, we had during the before the last elections in 2019, we had one particular state, a government had decided to give an unconditional money to all the farmers, universal, all the farmers for during 2 seasons, season 1 and if you own 1 acre of land, automatically the money comes to your bank account. Okay, and swept polls they got 95% of the seats in the assembly, and that tempted the national government, the national party BJP. Then they started quickly putting together and implementing, okay, we'll give this, but we'll target it because we'll give it to the farmers all over the country. And then somebody else started doing it. At that time, Sikkim, a small state of 600,000 people, they actually before the election said that we want to announce a full universal basic income. So the point is we cannot predict how and who will come and implement. In fact, 2017, it was the national government, BJP government, which actually wrote a full chapter on basic income in the economic survey and presented it to the parliament. But by the time the prime minister had to take a call on it, I think he had other views on it. So I think finally it will come from the politicians when they see it's not just about social justice. They will also see it's social justice plus political dividends if they are going to get. I think that it is that direction that it will move, but we don't know. But then the point is that we see our job is to interrogate the existing we spend our money, the way we design our programs. How do we design our programs, and what is our delivery history? I mean, there is evidence to show that we spend 3 rupees to deliver 1 rupee of welfare. I mean, it's criminal. So I mean, I see a lot of hope in India, definitely, but when and how it will come, we just cannot say. So there are many attractive elements. Government will, yeah.
No, please finish your
sentence. No, government is also coming to the universality. It's also coming to cash because of certain administrative efficiency that they see. That my administrative cost is going to come down. So government is coming from that end. If you see the document, the parliament. So, well, I mean, that's not the end. But still we wanted to talk to them and converse with them. So that's how the discussion is progressing.
I think that's a fascinating sort of insight, Sarath. You know, I mean, obviously I was taken in by your presentation on the freedom and the dignity aspect of this. I think that angle of using UBI as an instrument that affords fundamental human dignity and autonomy in terms of making choices. You know, Caroline talked about it earlier, but this idea of the ability to take risk, which conceptually is not the first thing you think about, but when you hear a practitioner walk you through it, that's brilliant. And you've just introduced this idea of, you know, administrative efficiency, so that all the other existing instruments of social security and social protection, you know, if you assess the cost of delivery versus just straight up handing out cash, you know, if in fact it's true, I mean, you've stated that the evidence from India, it's likely that that's consistent across many geographies and jurisdictions, not just in India. Megan, how can we sort of take all of this and use it to argue for the kind of fiscal burden that we're talking about here? Because I think, you know, there's a question with respect to especially larger countries. You know, when I hear Finland doing this, I mean, it's very impressive, and, you know, God bless the Finns. But, you know, I mean, come on, it's you know, whatever, it's a few million people. We're talking to Sarath, who is, you know, sitting in a country of 1.3 billion people. I'm sitting in a country of over 200 million, and the quantum of poverty is much higher. So you're not looking to save 10 million or 15 million lives. You're looking to save 100, in India's case, 600, 700 million. So what is the, I guess what I'm saying is, no matter all of these great arguments, the one sort of counter argument that's really difficult to beat is, hey man, we just don't have the money. We just can't afford it. How do we tackle that?
The $1 million or much higher dollar amount question. Yeah, and I think Caroline and Sarath are getting at it from both kind of the micro and the macro angles, and I think we can use them as complementary arguments. I mean, I think what Caroline said is spot on about the effectiveness of this type of intervention, right? When we talk about empowerment outcomes improving, The literature suggests that if you are not giving a significant amount of resources upfront, it really doesn't matter if you are providing financial inclusion training or business management training or extension services to farmers. If you are seeking to reach especially lower income, more vulnerable populations who are facing sort of intersecting and compounding barriers, if you don't give them a significant amount of assets in tandem with that kind of capacity building intervention, it's not worth your time and it's not worth your money. So from a cost effectiveness perspective, we often talk about bundling of interventions, including a large asset transfer like a UBI, and that's where we see that it's actually sort of worth the money for a government or for a donor institution to be investing, because the outcomes of the people they are seeking to benefit are more likely to improve and in a sustainable way. From what Sarath was mentioning at more of sort of the macro level, if we're thinking about government administrative bureaucracies, I think, oftentimes at CGD, we talk about cash benchmarking as a means of determining whether something is effective. And so if it's not going to be more impactful than just handing cash over to an individual to implement a large bureaucracy to deliver an intervention at scale, then just give the cash. And I think absolutely these things can be costly, but I think we always have to sort of come at this by saying in comparison to what, and over time, what are the cost savings as we seek to deliver this intervention, which not only from sort of a moral or an ethical perspective is much more driven towards an individual's dignity and agency, as Sarath mentioned earlier, but may also just be more cost effective over the long run.
Megan, this idea of individual dignity and freedom, obviously every speaker has talked about, especially whether it's the angle of gender or what we were talking about earlier in terms of how it frees up the potential of individuals, as demonstrated in the Kenya sort of experiment. Are there places in the developed world that have produced similar evidence of effectiveness on that front? Again, I know that Spain had invested in something that was quasi-UBI at the start of the pandemic. The Finland example, I think I've mentioned a couple of times because there's quite a lot of, they've done multiple rounds of experiments in Finland. What's the kind of, how would you distinguish the experience between the developed and the developing world?
Well, I can sort of share some insights from our work, and then I'm sure that Scott and others may be better positioned to speak to higher income contexts. I think when we are asking questions around ultimate outcomes, improvement or increases in human dignity, one thing that's come to mind as I've been listening to the other speakers is to be thinking intergenerationally about some of these issues. So whether we're thinking about higher income contexts where some of these human capital developments are already farther along, or whether we're looking at lower or middle income contexts where frankly we still have a pretty steep hill to climb in terms of getting girls into school and getting them to graduate at rates equal to boys, or thinking about older women and how to sort of support them as widows and as grandmothers. Something like UBI is going to facilitate the ability to make sure that across those generations, those human development outcomes can improve. So when we think about scarce resources being allocated within a poor household, we're often told, and the evidence suggests that it's going to be the boy that's prioritized in being sent to school, if only one person or several people's school fees can be paid. When there is a bigger pot, it's not that parents don't want to send their girl children to school, it's that they had to make that sort of strategic resource allocation decision. In gender restrictive contexts, it is unfortunately strategic to invest in the boy child over the girl child. But when you remove that sort of binding constraint, girls are also prioritized over time. If we think all the way sort of at the end of the age spectrum, we've looked at public childcare programs and other social assistance programs that are not just catalytic in terms of facilitating women's participation in and advancement in the paid workforce, but also grandmothers, who are often the ones, whether we're talking about here in the US or we're talking about Brazil or Kenya or what have you, those are the women who are stepping out of the workforce or becoming less productive and able to earn less income within it because the state is not providing a childcare option or some kind of income support to allow for that. So that's what I'd say from our research.
It's really, at some level, quite exciting, right? Because, I mean, what you said earlier really resonated about how if you have a skills development program, that program is less likely to succeed in the absence of something like a UBI. And once you have the supplementary income or the basic income that a UBI would provide, then the effectiveness of a Get Girls into School program, skills development program, farmer technical assistance program, all of those programs then are duly enhanced because of that extra capacity and that protection that the basic income affords. We have a few questions from audience members, and I'm going to start with you, Scott. Also request, if it's possible at all, to get some more light on you, the subject matter, rather than on the wall behind you, Scott. If you could shift around just a little bit, we want to get to see more. There you go, more of you. One of the questions, I mean, there's two questions around automation. The first is, how has automation affected the job market in Pakistan over the last 10 years, which I think is more generic, but we'll bunch that together with UBI is inevitable with automation and AI. How will UBI work when the US owns 50% of the financial assets across the world and the rest of the rich countries dominate also? We'll leave aside, if you want, we'll leave aside the political economy or the international relations part of that question. But this question of automation and the big fear that with the robots, we're all going to be out of work. Is that why UBI is such a big thing? I think that's really the question there.
Yeah, I mean, automation is certainly the, I would say, biggest avenue for people to get into the idea of basic income. But also, before I answer get into the automation discussion, I just want to mention too that there's something going on right now around the country that I think is really similar, or should be seen as similar to this discussion, and it's that with COVID, we're looking, okay, so we need a vaccine, and it's the question is not like, can we afford to do a vaccine? The question is, can we afford, not to do a vaccine? We need to get a vaccine as quickly as possible, because not having a vaccine is very costly, both in human terms and economic terms. So a vaccine is an investment, and it's just a common sense thing to do that a lot of people are working on. And it's important. And I think that when it comes to UBI, it should be seen in the exact same way, that poverty is extremely costly, both in human and economic terms. And UBI should be seen as a vaccine approach to this, because it does not make sense to wait until someone is in need and until they are suffering from all the consequences of a lack of resources. So, a healthcare system without UBI has to spend a lot more on healthcare to treat the downstream effects of what would have been avoided if we had prevented that with upstream access to resources via UBI. Same thing with crime, that it's very expensive, that there's more crime going on without UBI than there would be with it. And there's a lot lower productivity than there would be with it. So a lack of UBI is expensive. Poverty is not free. And people need to realize that and understand that we have to invest in each other in order to make sure that we don't have to spend all of these resources on other things when we could have just done it up front via a vaccine approach. So that said, when it turns to automation, yeah, automation is real. And we are seeing the effects of automation around the world. We've been seeing it for decades. It's not functioning in the way that people think that it functions. So it doesn't work like when a machine is able to do the job of a person. It's not that those jobs are eliminated and then those people are left without any work whatsoever, and you see this growing population of people without jobs and people with jobs. The problem of automation that we've been seeing is that as automation increases and you're able to automate these tasks, because people don't have the choice to not work, they have to go back into the labor market to find something else. Then you also see a reduction of incomes, that there's a pressure downwards on wages as people seek out these new forms of, say, lower skilled work, because that's the stuff that can't be automated yet. And so we see this divergence where people are just doing so much worse. They're just barely getting by at the same time as increasing productivity, which is, it just doesn't make any sense at all. Where we're as automation, as technology advances, everyone should be better off because productivity is enhancing. If we are producing twice as much stuff, if we're doing it with half as much effort, then that should accrue to everybody. So back in the 70s here in the US, since then we've been twice as productive. So we should be all either working half as much or we should be consuming twice as much, but it's not the case. Wages haven't kept up with this divergence of productivity and wages. So as automation increases around the world, you're going to continue to see these wage issues, this wage stagnation that's not going to go anywhere. And that, again, is why UBI is so important. You have to have that floor, and that floor also operates to boost wages, and it also operates to boost bargaining power so that people can refuse to do these jobs that don't even need to exist, and they refuse to do the jobs at the wages that those who are only benefiting from the automation are demanding. And that's really an important element of this, is that we have to value humans more than we have been, and we have to realize that the point of technology itself is to make sure that we are better off, that we should focus on well-being, and that's what the UBI does. It's effectively a dividend on technology that goes to everyone in the form of time and dignity and freedom and power. And it's interesting, that really is a kind of, what would you say basic income is? And it's a redistribution of power in a way that you just don't see outside of, say, democracy itself was a redistribution of power. So as we go forward, that's the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, that in and of itself is powerful. Thank you for that. I think you dealt with the automation question really well. Again, I would request, and I'm having our team is also messaging me asking to somehow get you to fix the light there. So while you work on the light, I want to take you to Caroline. And Caroline, there's a question here from Mohammad Zubair Javed, and he's asking, how can these UBI programs contribute to poverty alleviation, and how can one quantify the results of these UBI in terms of poverty alleviation? Now, I just want to share my standard response to this is that the discussion about either social protection or UBI is not actually about poverty alleviation. It is, in fact, about human dignity, and it's about basic rights and fulfilling those. But if we were forced to answer this question, how can we answer it from the experience that you and GiveDirectly have had out there in Kenya?
Thanks a lot. And the main reason why we are also moving a UBI globally is because of the inequalities that are existing, economic inequalities that are existing between, what Sarath would, define as the leisure class and, people living in extreme poverty. While UBI may not be the panacea for poverty, you want to think about, issues like dignity and choice. that for a very long time, there have been, these paternalistic attitudes from donors and from external parties who have prescribed what in their mind have been the best decisions and the best solutions for poverty. What UBI is doing is it's giving people a space on that decision-making table to help donors also see what it is that can change their lives for the better. Because as I sit in Nairobi, I wouldn't know what someone in Pakistan would need. I wouldn't know what someone in, even as close as Western Kenya here, I wouldn't know what each individual requires to change their lives. But in development, we have adopted perpetually this know-it-all attitude where we prescribe, we discuss interventions in the boardrooms, we put them in statistical analysis, and we create imaginations of what a solution it would be. And this takes me to, the question around benchmarking. And we know and we have seen that there have been studies that have tested some of these paternalistic decisions that have been put across for people to challenge or to, to address the poverty situation in different parts of the world. One of them is, for example, providing financial knowledge. At GiveDirectly, we have done a study in Rwanda where we were comparing equal investments in provision of financial knowledge and provision of cash, and another one that provides both cash and financial knowledge. And when the rubber met the road, results showed that financial knowledge did not move the needle that much. Cash actually moved the needle significantly. And when both of them were put together, there was actually no difference. So if you are doing a program that you think is going to impact people's lives, the one thing that you should ask yourself, is it going to do better than just giving people that money that you're going to be investing? The other thing that, the other example is investments that have gone into microfinance. And when we sit in boardrooms and think about implementing microfinance in microfinance projects, our minds and our educated brains tell us that when you give people a loan, they're definitely going to invest that money and they will make more profit, and then they can return that money with some interest and remain with that money. My friend, microfinance projects ask poor people to pay as high as 20% of the in terms of interest. Which business would give you 20% plus profit? I can tell you for sure in Kenya, it doesn't work. We have gotten people back into worse situations of poverty because we have given them expensive loans and have decided that the only way that their lives can change for the better is by doing businesses. A mother will not put a loan into a business when her children are going hungry. She will buy food. I can assure you of that. A sick person will only do a business when they are well. But when they get sick, they will take even that money from the business and take it to the hospital. And then who will salvage that business when you're knocking on their doors, coming to auction the little property that they have, to reclaim your business? It is slavery. And when you come to automation, that right now the world is moving into automation. Automation is going to get us into a world of more exclusion. And you can imagine people who are living in extreme poverty. Even before you address the idea of moving them out of the poverty, there are people at the bottom of the pyramid who cannot even eat. Where did we lose our humanity? Where did we lose the social value of letting people live a human life of dignity? I don't have to live rich or wealthy. I have to live with dignity. That it is very inhuman that there are people who can eat and eat in excess, and there are others who can't even eat. There is an example of this in Kenya where we had one woman whose story was told was not a beneficiary of a basic income, but a good example of why we should not look at a basic income as alleviating poverty, but delivering dignity. This woman literally collected stones and put in a pan and put fire and started cooking stones to give hope to her children that she was making food for them, in the hope that these children would sleep. Why would we let people cook stones when there are resources that can be redistributed? I'm thinking about, when you think about UBI and the many people who are living in poverty, can we think about the value of automation in how it can help us scale up the delivery of a UBI? Today, people are investing in automation for creation of more wealth. Can we use that automation for predictive data generation to help us predict people who are living in extreme poverty and redistribute wealth created by automated processes so that the world can live in a more dignified, morally sorry. I like the idea of a UBI being a vaccine to poverty. But when you look at it, for example, right now with COVID-19, you'd want to ask, has COVID-19 opened our eyes to the need for a UBI? And the answer is not just a yes. COVID-19 has challenged us that globally we should be preparing to respond to disasters. Right now at GiveDirectly, we've been able to deliver cash to over 400,000 people in Africa. But one of the biggest problems is, where do we get the poor people? Poor people are excluded. Nobody has their data. And we are here sitting with lots of knowledge that we've invested in automation. What is automation when people are living in poverty, cannot be found, are hidden in ditches of informal settlements and streets? What is automation without the morality of helping people to live dignified lives? It is time we started thinking as humans rather than starting to think like, capitalists making more wealth, and thinking about you can only be a decent human being if you can make more and more money and more wealth.
Caroline, that's one of the most fun interventions that I've hosted. I've been doing this for a while. Thank you for everything that you just said. Extremely powerful and moving, and I'm I think something that I'll be playing over and over again for myself and for others. On the question of data, one of the sort of arguments or one of the rays of hope that we see here in Pakistan is the data that the mobile companies have, the telecom providers, because where governments have failed people, whether it's in San Francisco or in Nairobi or in Karachi, the telecom providers have not. The antennas are everywhere. Where there is no government, there's still an antenna. Where there's no UBI, there's still an antenna. And people have started to use telecom services, and particularly data in this day and age, as almost, after oxygen and water, maybe more important than food in many cases. How have you found the responsiveness of telco providers in Africa? Is there a big move towards telco providers working with organizations like yours to help tackle this question of data?
Very good question. So what we are doing right now, GiveDirectly is actually delivering cash in Togo, and it is purely contactless, and we are using data, predictive data from telco in Togo. So basically, they're running analysis using machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us know who is the poorest and where do they live. So using the mass of telcos, you can actually be able to know, the location of a person. And with that location, you can be able to tell if somebody is living in a poor environment or not. You can be able to know how people transact through their mobile money. So you can see how quickly and how much money is loaded, the traffic of funds in their accounts. You can see how people buy airtime for calling, that a poor person would always be called in and will not be buying airtime, and how much calls compared to SMSs people are sending. So that type of predictive data is helping us to locate people in Togo. In Uganda, we also have support from MTN Uganda in locating people who are using the MTN services, and we are using that to target them in poor locations in Uganda. Our hope is that, this type of innovation can be used across the world, and for people who are advocating for programs such as a UBI and people who are responding in disaster situations, I think it is time that we invested money upfront in finding these people and building databases that can help us deliver cash. And like the one in Togo, what we're doing in Togo is actually delivering cash instantly. We get the data, and at that same minute, within 2 minutes, you have already started receiving your money. So increasing efficiency and also responding to people's needs immediately is critical. And data, as you say, is very, very critical in this equation.
Megan, as you might have discovered when you were looking at ESAS, one of the ways in which the ESAS program qualified people to receive the ESAS Emergency Cash Grant was by triangulation of data. So there were many data sources, but one of them was the data that the cellular companies or the telecom providers were using. Clearly, there's examples in Africa that Caroline has really so expertly summarized. There is evidence here in Pakistan. To what extent can this become a kind of counterpoint to UBI? In a sense, the more data that we have, the more there'll be bureaucrats and politicians who will feel empowered to say, look, now that we have all this data, why give money under UBI to Megan and Musharraf who don't need it or may not need it? Why not only focus on those folks that really need it? And look, we have all this magical data. Can data or the overabundance of data and technology become a counterpoint to UBI?
Before I definitely agree with the risks and the challenges that are associated with big data, I think it's fair to say that we're a long way from that risk. In terms of how much knowledge we still need to generate in order to feel confident enough to be able to target appropriately. I mean, even pre-COVID, we're doing a bit of work right now examining different social protection programs across 10 countries in Latin America. And those programs, while trying to ease considerations of poverty and food insecurity, had real difficulty accessing people and reaching them to ensure that those living below the extreme poverty line were benefiting. So to Caroline's earlier point, and others have raised, this challenge of being able to access those most in need, data harnessed by telcos and through other digital platforms is absolutely an opportunity, but we still have quite a ways to go. In terms of acknowledging those challenges, I'd say a couple of different things. The first is, of course, that we know how people make use of their cellular phones, and that it is not as simple as saying, it's one SIM card registered on one mobile phone to one individual. We know that not just those in the leisure class, but across the spectrum, men disproportionately more than women, they may have multiple SIM cards, multiple mobile phones, whereas a woman may not have any, or something registered in her name that she actually doesn't have full autonomy and control over, right? There's someone over her shoulder. There's someone managing her communication. So thinking about coverage issues and how we translate that data to get a really accurate picture at an individual level, still work to be done there. The other thing that you alluded to, in terms of risks around consumer protection and sort of privacy and confidentiality concerns, colleagues at CGD, Michael Pisa and a team right now are working on a project that seeks to sort of strike that perfect balance between the benefits that big data can offer us, while also guarding against some of those risks. And the final thing I'd say is, really sort of getting us back to a moral or, again, an ethical standpoint. When we look at the US context, the idea of our social security system, for example, right? It was designed very intentionally to not be about a certain income cutoff or a certain amount of need, but rather the fact that, as many of us always say, Bill Gates is going to get the same check as someone who is living in much more meager circumstances. And so I think, would be curious to hear thoughts from Scott and others about whether we continue from sort of a human dignity perspective to toe that same line, or whether there are questions down the line once we feel much more confident in the data we do have about whether resources could be targeted and therefore used more efficiently. But again, I think that's a ways off.
So let's take that question to Sarath. Sarath, India has these icons of wealth. Let's take Mukesh Ambani. So, on the one hand, you have Mukesh Ambani. On the other hand, you have, somebody living in Navi Mumbai or in one of the slums in Dharavi in Mumbai. Do both of them deserve a universal basic income? And what is the logic for that? I mean, I think that's a really powerful question that in a sense, Megan has prompted me to think about.
Well, I would say universal basic income is not about poverty alleviation. Take that, I think, from Caroline to Megan to Scott, I think all of us, we have emphasized the fact that it is delivering dignity. That's a great phrase, Caroline. You can patent it. The point is, it's like when you stand in a queue to vote, you are standing there as a citizen, okay? And for rich people, for Mukesh Ambani and his family, there is no special line. So the point is that when we say universal, there is a solidarity and invoking the citizenship, basically, in the sense that there is a sense of belonging. So the point, you can give, I mean, if you can choose. The problem is about targeting. Any kind of targeting will automatically be arbitrary. There is no foolproof targeting. So in order not to, every targeting excludes people. In fact, I think Scott really explained in the beginning on how what exactly happened. So the reason why we give to everybody is one philosophical reason is that you should have a sense of solidarity. Number two, so that you exclude anybody. And there are always ways of clawing it back from the rich. I mean, government knows how to do this. It's not a rocket science. So I think we should aim for that. Should aim for that as the ultimate. For example, when Bolsa Familia was enacted as a law, they actually in the Constitution they had mentioned that we eventually would like to go to universal basic income, but this is a one step, but further steps were not taken. That's a different matter. But then that's I think we also should think of that kind of a progression to a universal basic income. Ideally, we should have a universal basic income. And let Mukesh Ambani get it and back to the country. I can give you an example of what we have done about, for example, in India, we had an experiment about a couple of years ago. Earlier, government was giving subsidy to oil companies in order to sell the cooking gas at a cheaper rate to the entire nation. It's a universal, even today it's universal. We get universally, every citizen gets a subsidy on cooking gas. Government said, brought in more players in the field because at that time all the oil companies were government owned. Then they said they brought in private players, and then they said, okay, we will not subsidize you, we will subsidy directly to the citizen. They asked all citizens to open bank accounts and link them to our Aadhaar card, national identity card. It happened. And the oil companies were forced to put their act together, and they said, you sell it whatever you want to sell, we will subsidize the. So government apparently has saved enormous amount of money. And then came the Prime Minister and made an appeal to all those people who don't need this subsidy, give up your subsidy. Okay, so people gave, I think about several million actually gave up their subsidy, and they said that we don't want the subsidy. Now, the point I'm trying to make, the principle should be universal. And then how you claw it back, how you operate it, how you design it is a matter of detail rather than principle.
On that note, Sarath, I had pledged that I would start and end with you, and my God, what a great decision that was. What an absolute pleasure to have all four of you join us and explain the issues in this in the manner that you did. The compassion and the moral center of gravity of the argument that you've made is, at least for me, I was already convinced, but I hope that those who watched, who have a different mindset and who don't think as much about these things in those, were able to see the value of that. You are all brothers and sisters in different parts of the world, but working for the same end. And so I salute the work that you do. I'm not given to being particularly emotive about these conversations. This is the 19th one that I've done, or rather 17th or 18th, a couple that others have hosted, but by far the one that I've been inspired by the most. And every one of you, I mean, thank you for making time. This was really something else. I hope you'll keep coming back and enlightening us. There's so many more aspects of UBI that deserve to be talked about, and I hope that we'll be able to do that together in the future. Thank you all for joining us, and if you have any parting thoughts, please do share them before we sign out.
Thank you. I guess I'll just throw in a quick parting thought myself, and it's just that try to get around basic income as only being money, because it's about so much more than that. It's unconditionality. That unconditionality, universality means that when you ask someone if they're in need or not, what do you mean by that? Maybe they don't need money. Maybe it's that they need security. Maybe that's they need power or dignity. And so let's stop deciding and judging people that way, and let's just trust people with an amount of resources that they can decide for themselves what it is that they need, instead of the rest of us deciding for people what they need. And I think that we can create a better world by actually starting on a base and a foundation of trust.
That's maybe the best possible way for us to sign out. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Sarath. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Caroline. We look forward to welcoming you back to Tabadlab and doing this again real soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye, Caroline, Megan. Bye. Bye, Musharraf.
Bye-bye.